Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perdichizzi, and thank you for joining me as always. Really excited to be joined by special guests today. It is Mr. Mike Clay of ESPN. Mike, welcome back to the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast.
Yeah, you got it. It's been a while, so good to hop back on and talk some football.
Yeah, absolutely. I love bringing you on every year around the summertime just to kind of pick your brain a little bit about the upcoming rookies, as they get ready to start off their rookie season. Training camps, set to kick off in about a month or so. So let's jump right into it. When you do your rookie rankings, when you intertwine them into your dynasty ranks, maybe just give a little refresher on how do you take into account college production / film, draft capital, current depth chart? How do you kind of look at it? How do you kind of intertwine all of them to kind of produce your rankings in terms of how you look at these guys?
Yeah, the answer is yes, all of those things, right? So just like you, I spend, a lot of time in the off season studying these guys even before the draft and having rankings set up, having good scouting reports. Obviously I'm tracking things that we learn about them at the combine, but things as simple as, their height, their weight, their age, obviously is a factor. And not just looking at, how good they were at college, but how they were utilized. Some things like scramble rate, is something that we didn't always have access to that we could look at now and get a better feel for, if a guy's going to run the ball a lot at the collegiate level, like CJ Stroud being an example of a guy who barely scrambled, or, Bryce Young kind of had an average scramble rate at the college level. So it's a lot of things like that. It's not just efficiency at that level in production. It's also utilization and what style of player they are. And then we kind of, look at, we learn a lot from the draft. Obviously, what the NFL thinks of these players is super important. That's the most important thing, actually, in terms of correlating success at the NFL level. So that's, obviously I'm going to adjust for that a bit as well. Once I process the results and find out which team they're on, just to kind of cap that up with your other question, which is depth chart, it depends. I mean, dynasty, not really worried about it, unless it's like an extreme situation, right? Like Zach Charbonnet is a guy who we might be, if he went to Cincinnati and they cut Joe Mixon, we might be talking about him as a top 12 dynasty running back and season long as an RB2 right out of the gate. But instead he goes to Seattle, and it's not just that Ken Walker III is there. It's that Ken Walker III is there for at least 3 more years, right? He was a second-round pick last year. So these guys are going to be tied to each other here for the next few seasons, and it's going to limit his upside, whereas, it would have been drastically different elsewhere. But otherwise, from a dynasty perspective, landing spot's not quite as important. Short-term, obviously a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me bring in the quarterback discussion for a second. The consensus, not for everyone, but the consensus is most people have Anthony Richardson as their top rookie quarterback, whether it be redraft, dynasty, big picture, rookie drafts. If still people haven't had them yet and they have them later in the summer. From your rankings, it looks like you are a little bit of a different than what has been out there. Is you having Bryce Young over Anthony Richardson? Is it a little bit of the concern of what Anthony Richardson was, the player in college, and maybe not overhyping the athleticism and rushing ability that have so many people, eagerly excited about Richardson's skill set and maybe pushing him even further up ranks?
Yeah, so I think that Bryce Young might max out as like maybe an average contributor as a rusher. Right. And obviously that's the big deal here is, right, what they're going to add in terms of their legs. And that's why Anthony Richardson has such a high ceiling, because there's all these concerns about his passing efficiency. But, he could be a below average passer and still be a really good fantasy quarterback. So, I'm weighing both of those things. I think Young, and Carolina agrees, is more likely to be a long-term good NFL starting quarterback. I think a lot of teams had Young and probably Stroud ahead of Richardson on their board. And so that's a factor. I thought going into the process, Young was the best fantasy prospect quarterback in this class. And I think that, you can make a case that Stroud is right there at 2. And then Richardson's there. But I mean, again, I think if you weigh all of the things we just talked about, and one of those things is bust rate, the possibility of being a bust, I think that Richardson's is substantially higher, right? I just think Young has a better chance of being a solid, good starting quarterback with an effective passer. So that's why I gave him the edge, and I stuck with it through even after the draft. But there's no doubt about it. Richardson's ceiling is just enormous because of, his skill set and what he brings to the table as, with his legs.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's going to be interesting because I think Bryce Young is the one, obviously, the mental processing is where Young really shines. And you've already heard whispers about, how good he's looked in that regard, some of the stuff that's came out there. If we take this over to the running backs, it's a weird kind of running back class, right? We know we have Bijan and Jahmyr Gibbs at the top. I don't think a lot of discussion is really needed with those two. But if we take it to that next group of guys, you mentioned Charbonnet before, and right, the landing spot kind of hurts his overall value. But after Bijan, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Zach Charbonnet, can you talk maybe a little bit about that next group of guys? Because overall, I think you're a little bit more on the conservative approach in terms of having more of the wide receivers ranked higher than them. And I'm right there with you in lockstep. I prefer some of those day 2 wide receivers over the day 2 running backs. But some thoughts maybe on Tyjae Spears. Roshan Johnson was even the beginning of day 3, Tank Bigsby, and that kind of group of running backs.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked this question because I loved in the pre-draft process a lot of guys in this area. Spears, Kendre Miller went to New Orleans, and Roshan Johnson were three guys that stuck out as being really high efficiency players. And I said before, it's not all about efficiency, but 2 stats that have helped me a lot in dynasty drafts over the years have been yards after contact and forced missed tackles. And those sort of efficiency metrics are becoming more commonplace now, but they weren't in the past. And that's where you could find gems like a Kareem Hunt or, sleepers like Chris Carson and Jordan Howard. I think Chris Carson maybe and Howard, probably 2 of my better calls all time in terms of, rookie flyers. And those were guys that were not high pedigree, day 3 draft picks. So those are the kind of things I'm looking at. And that applies here. Another bear, actually, following the Jordan Howard lead with Roshan Johnson. I think he's really interesting, good size, and we'll see how he carves things out as a pass catcher in the pros, but is a good pass blocker. And that Bears depth chart really wide open, right? With Deontay Foreman, Khalil Herbert, they bring in Travis Homer as more of a special teamer / receiving specialist. So a lot of names, but no clear number 1. So we'll see if Johnson gets a shot there. Kendre Miller, obviously similar dynamic with Alvin Kamara potentially facing suspension. He's an opportunity to earn a big early season role. Intriguing player for sure. And Spears, he was like my favorite running back in the class. I know there's, some injury concerns about him long-term. How's his knee going to hold up? But from an efficiency standpoint, the guy was just, he's the best profile. Looking at Yak and forced missed tackle rate, he is the best profile in this class. And yes, that includes some fella named Bijan Robinson. So super, super pumped for Spears. He's going to sit and learn a little bit behind Derrick Henry. But, I'm excited to see him as a lead back at some point.
And one name there I want to bring up also is Devin Achane. When you look at a guy like Devin Achane, when you put him in your ranks, do you listen to the rumors like the Dalvin Cook stuff? Like, does that come into the picture at all when you're ranking him right now? Or is that just, if it happens, I adjust after the fact, and his ranking is more just based on maybe concerns about his size, his frame, his workload, situation?
Yeah, you said it. I actually don't want Dalvin Cook to go there because I want people to keep reaching on Achane in drafts, and because then that's guys that I actually like I'll get in drafts because I don't want him. I don't understand the appeal. I don't know why he's going so early. The guy's 5'8", 188. He's super fast. He's explosive. He's going to make some big plays, but I don't see him ever being a guy you feel great starting as an RB1 or RB2. He's just not maybe he has like that sort of Naheem Hines, J.D. McKissick sort of like flex value as a situational player that hits for the big play here or there. Maybe that's it, but I don't see a guy that's his size having much of a ceiling in fantasy. I don't get it. So again, I like it for Miami. I think it's a nice addition to that backfield, that explosive nature, and that's going to help them out. But we see players like that across the league that are not fantasy relevant. So I just don't get it at that size. I don't understand his ADP. And I've done a bunch of rookie drafts, obviously, so far. And anytime he comes off the board way earlier than he should, I'm happy about that.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to kind of see how that backfield plays itself out. Let's turn to the pass catchers a little bit. I want to start with the tight ends because I do think looking at your ranks, obviously 4 guys taken relatively high, and it looks like you're even a fan of Luke Schoonmaker as well there with Dallas. Most people have Kincaid as their number 1 guy. I think then it opens up a little bit for debate. Most rankings out there have Laporta at number 2. Looking at your rankings, you kind of have Michael Mayer almost like in a tier of his own before like a little separation down to Musgrave and Laporta. Is that situational in terms of where he went for Michael Mayer? Is it college production? What is it that maybe has you a little bit higher on Michael Mayer than a guy like Sam Laporta and Luke Musgrave?
Yeah, there's a little pedigree there. I mean, Mayer was the consensus number one tight end pretty much across the board going into the draft process. I know I shouldn't say that. I guess it was pretty close, right? Mayer was for more so the number one tight end by most groups, but I guess some people kind of jumped on the Kincaid bandwagon. I know PFF was really high on him, but Mayer pretty much the consensus one, and there's a reason for that, right? I mean, the guy was absurdly productive at the college level. His target share and usage was just massive throughout his entire career. So I think he has a pretty high floor as a receiver in the NFL. It's obviously his pass catching role, and that's going to keep him in that tight end one conversation. So I feel really good about him. Kincaid, I actually had Mayer ahead of Kincaid pre-draft. I bumped Kincaid up because of chasing the pedigree there. He went in the first round. I'm not going to ignore that. He obviously is a terrific receiver and is massive fantasy upside. So I have Kincaid one. Yeah, Mayer, just like him a lot. I think he's a better prospect than Laporta. And, they were drafted close enough to each other that pedigree is not a big deal here. So I'm going to go with the guy I like. And the landing spots are both good. Like Austin Hooper's there in Vegas, but that's not a guy you're too scared of, especially long-term. Laporta, fine. I like it. Again, we'll see. I mean, year one's not really the breakout age for tight end. So we're just going to kind of play it out, see how they do in their first year, and then kind of try to buy low on these guys heading into their second season.
Yeah, and one more follow-up with Luke Musgrave. Is it a situation where when a team takes two guys on day two at the same position, is that make it a little bit more challenging to kind of project? Like, is it simply as they took him higher, so we think that that's going to be the way it goes, or does it lead to the college production, right? So it was a unique circumstance that you don't usually see. Every once in a while, we've seen a team like Hayden Hurst, Baltimore took Hayden Hurst, and then Mark Andrews. We've seen the Patriots double dip a little bit at tight end in the same draft class. So that was a little bit of an unusual move there by Green Bay. Does that impact where you have Musgrave and what you think of him, that they also drafted Tucker Kraft on day two?
Yeah, definitely. In Baltimore, by the way, famous for that. They did that with Ed Dixon and Dennis Pitta as well. They like to go to go all in on the tight end position in the same draft. So the Packers kind of following that lead. And yeah, it does make it tough. It's, if Kraft, actually, speaking of, you mentioned Andrews, I actually liked him more than Hurst. He was drafted after Hurst, and I thought he was the better pass catching prospect, and that actually worked out. So I say that not to pat myself on the back, but because if you prefer Kraft, then fade Musgrave and go Kraft, right? Because it could certainly work out that way. So I liked Musgrave more pre-draft, so that's why I have him a few spots ahead. But yeah, I'm a little nervous having him at 4. The thing is, the reason he's not lower is because the other guys have similar concerns. Like Schoonmaker, I don't think he's quite as good of a pass catching prospect, but I've seen Dawson Knox comps. He's a little older. There's at least something there. He was drafted in the second round. Obviously, Dallas thinks he's going to be their starting tight end for a long time with that sort of pedigree. So he's close, but like Darnell Washington's, he's attached to Pat Freiermuth now for years, right? We just talked about Kraft. Brenton Strange, I don't know if he's ever going to be much of a pass catcher. Evan Ingram's there in the short term. Cameron Latou in San Francisco is behind George Kittle. So there's no one else really to jump sort of ahead of Musgrave. But yeah, no doubt about it. I don't feel super pumped drafting him as much as I would some of these other guys who don't have as much young competition.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Let's spin this over to the wide receivers. A couple questions here to round it out. I think Jackson Smith and the Jigba at number 1 is pretty self-explanatory. I think a lot of people have ranked the next 3, the other first-round wide receivers, Jordan Addison, Zay Flowers, and Quentin Johnston. I think a lot of people can make a strong argument in any way, shape, or form in terms of who you like the most and how you rank those guys. I see Quentin Johnston's atop of that trio. Maybe a little, some quick thoughts on why you prefer maybe Johnson slightly compared to Addison and Zay. Is it simple as size? Is it the quarterback pairing? What is it that you like Johnston over the other two a little bit more?
Yeah, size is nice for sure. Love the wingspan. Love the fact that he could be, play all over the fields, be a perimeter option, not just a slot guy necessarily, or a undersized guy that could limit certain things. I think these are pretty well-rounded players, but being 6'2", 208 versus 5'11", 170, has its benefits. So also he was the second receiver picked. I think that tells us a little bit about what the league thinks of Johnston versus Addison and Flowers. Not a lot, obviously. It was really close, but honestly, I mean, look, I could have kept Johnson 1. Like, I have no problem if you want to go Johnson ahead of Smith and Jigba, right? I think he's a terrific prospect. I know a lot of platforms had him number 1 as well. Really good at the combine, crushed the vertical and the broad, right? There's really a lot to like about him. So different types of players. It's really that similar. I just think Johnson's a slightly better prospect. But look, these guys were, you just never see this happen, right? Picked 4 consecutive picks, all 4 of these receivers. The warning I would give, though, is that, last year I thought that the first round receivers and the rookie receivers altogether were undervalued. They were just so easy to get in drafts, and I didn't understand it because early first round receivers generally get a big target shares and they're super productive. So guys like Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson and Drake London, who had his ups and downs, but it was fantasy relevant. Like, those guys were undervalued. And then this year, it's like it's the opposite, right? These guys were picked in the 20s in the first round, and their ADPs are ridiculous, especially Smith and Jigba, who's going ahead of Tyler Lockett in underdog drafts. And I just don't understand it, especially if you look at the success rate in year 1 of receivers drafted in the second half of the first round. It's not that good. There's Justin Jefferson, sure, but most of the guys weren't that good. There's just not that many top 20 or 30, top 35 receivers in year 1 from that area of the draft. So that's the only warning I would give. But, long term, I do like all these guys.
Yeah, and all of these guys, you can poke holes in each of their spots, especially like you said for year 1. Like, I'm right there with you. I'm stunned that Smith and Najigba's redraft value is where it is. I love him long term, but I mean, same thing. Quentin Johnson behind Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, Jordan Addison. You can make the case it's probably Justin Jefferson and Hawkinson in terms of target opportunity year 1. Zay Flowers. We got to see Baltimore. I think they're going to be a different type of pass offense this year, but I think it's going to be one of those things until we see it. We're not ready to believe it. What's Beckham's situation going to look like? I feel like Rashad Bateman on the outs, but maybe, who knows? Maybe he's got a bounce back year in him there, and maybe that's not the case. I think one of the more fascinating things about the wide receiver rookies this year is the day 2 guys, because like I'm looking at your rankings here, and this is the same for all people's rankings, right? From number 7 on your rankings to like 23. There is day 2 wide receivers all over the place, right? In all different spots. And I feel like it was one of the harder things to kind of rank and put where to rank these day 2 wide receivers and where to mix in some tight ends and some running backs. So I see for you, Rashee Rice, Marvin Mims, and Jaden Reed kind of started that day 2 run of wide receivers. What is it about that trio, Rashee Rice, Marvin Mims, and Jaden Reed, that make you a little bit more intrigued with those guys than some of the other day 2 guys?
Yeah, a little bit of chasing pedigree there, right? I mean, a second round pick on a wide receiver is pretty notable. And usually that's a sign these guys are going to get a real opportunity to be, have a significant role, perhaps right out of the gate. Rice obviously has that in a really good Chiefs offense, and that kind of pushed him to the top. Love that landing spot, like the player. Mims is interesting, right? When he was drafted, I immediately thought, man, maybe they're not really telling the whole truth, and they actually are going to trade someone like a Sutton or a Judy, but because they have Tim Patrick there as well, it's like there's a lot of mouths to feed. So that one I don't love short term, but I think he's a really good player. So good speed as well. So he's interesting long term. Probably just gonna be a situational player this year. And Jaden Reed, I mean, as far as, and actually I'll throw Jonathan Mingo here as well. I mean, these are guys that could potentially be their number 2, dare I say number 1 receiver at some point on their team this year. I like Christian Watson a lot, but he's not, we don't know for sure on him. He's played a half a season as a full-time player. We'll see how good Reed is. And then Mingo, of course, Carolina's wide receiver room is wide open, right? Terrace Marshall, Adam Thielen, and DJ Chark, that's a job that's for the taking. So if any of these guys are legit, they're going to claim a pretty substantial role. And that especially applies to Rice, Reed, and Mingo, just based on the depth chart that they landed in.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see. Like, I'm a big fan of Jaden Reed. I love Marvin Mims pre-draft. Like, some of these guys are, going to be thrust into a situation, and we'll see who can run with it, and who maybe struggles a little bit out of the gates. Last question of the night from those other day 2 wide receivers. I think most of the ones I'm looking at here on your list, they were round 3 guys. So we're talking Josh Downs, Cedric Tillman, Tank Dell, and Jalen Hyatt. Is there one of that group of 4 there that maybe intrigues you the most long term in terms of ceiling or upside?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Hyatt. I have him highest, of that group. I think that someone, I want to say Lance Zierlein. I think maybe had him number 1 overall, like of all his. Lance is great. Of all his receivers, ahead of Smith and Jigba in the first rounders, like he loved him, and that caught my eye for sure. Young player. The Giants' passing game is still a bit of a question mark. The Giants are dead last in passing touchdowns over the last 3 seasons. perhaps some upgrades they made with Darren Waller and some healthier receivers and Hyde in the mix, maybe they turn the corner this season, but we don't know. Like, who's the real Daniel Jones? Is this a guy that, can throw 25 to 30 touchdowns, or is he going to stay in the teens like he has the last few seasons? So that makes it a little tricky. And also it makes it tricky because he could play, his range of outcomes really for a lot of these Giants receivers is massive, right? I mean, Hyatt, when you think about who else is there, right? Darius Slayton, and they brought in Paris Campbell this year. And, they've Sterling Shepard and Wan'Dale Robinson coming off major injury. And out of nowhere last year, we saw Isaiah Hodgins make an impact. I don't even know. Did I say Darius Slayton? He's there. Jamison Crowder they signed. We'll see if he makes the team. So, Hyatt, if he's legit, right? Like he's a player that's going to pan out and be an NFL starter. He could be their number one receiver within the first month of the season, right? Like the cream rises, he'll be there. But also he's 21, right? If he needs a little bit of development, it's possible he's a healthy scratch or just barely sees the field. He's a 3rd round pick. It's not like he's a 1st rounder. So that makes him a little bit tricky to sort out, but it is appealing. He's an appealing prospect. Obviously he was a day 2 pick, and that depth chart being wide open is a very interesting wild card.
Yeah. And we always, you even mentioned before, right? There's been a lot of success of round 2 running wide receivers taken. And it's one of those things now with all these great videos that come out from the teams in terms of like draft room coverage. Like there's a lot of videos out there showing that the Giants were either taking John Michael Schmidt in round 2 or Jalen Hyatt. When the Bears traded up, they thought they thought they were taking John Michael Schmidt, and then they were taking Jalen Hyatt. And I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but pick 59 compared to like the 3rd round, there's enough of a difference where it's like, okay, they were willing to take him as high as round 2, and they had him targeted when day 2 started. So it's like, yeah, they think very highly of him, and it sounds like it's a lot, but I think it does say something that they look at him, I think, as a guy who can maybe rise, like you said, to the top and be there. Just how long does it take him to get there? So that'll be interesting to follow for sure. Mike, I always appreciate this. I know you're very busy with everything you got going on. So thank you so much. I'm sure most of my audience knows where to follow your work and where to follow you on Twitter, or maybe I should say where to follow you on Threads. But please let the audience know, what you're working on. I always type up your projections. I think they're the best in the industry. But anything else you want to share with the audience in terms of where to follow you, what you're working on over the summer as we gear up for the next NFL season?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if Threads becomes a thing, but I am on there at Mike Clay NFL, same as Instagram and Twitter. Same old, just pumping out content, writing a lot. Have a bunch of articles already filed that'll be coming in over at ESPN.com. Of course, I have that 90-page PDF, something like that with, I'm losing track. I keep adding things to it. I have all like the starting lineups in there and all that fun stuff. So that the PDF is routinely updated, and I haven't had to lately because we're in the rare quiet point in this season. But that's updated as well as everything else over at ESPN.com and in our magazines out in newsstands here in a couple days. So make sure you pick that up as well.
Guys, make sure you're following Mike everywhere. Make sure you're following out all his great work, using his projections and all of his great insight. So on behalf of Mike, on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nakano, and myself, thank you for joining us, and we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.